Hey there, I'm Rod Yates. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Humans of Music, a Jaxsta podcast. Each episode I talk to a music creator or industry professional about their life and career, the ups and downs of their journey and the lessons they've learned. And my special guest for the next hour is the Cult guitarist, Billy Duffy. Since forming the Cult with vocalist Ian Astbury in 1983, Billy has proven himself to be one of those guitarists who can shapeshift musically, yet still sound like Billy Duffy. So whether you're listening to the more indie-leaning sounds of 1985's Love, the AC/DC-styled rock of 1987's Electric, or the arena rock bombast of 1989's Sonic Temple, it all sounds like the work of Billy Duffy. The Cult rode a big wave of success over the course of those albums I just mentioned, but by 1995 the musical landscape had changed, as had the Cult's fortunes. They went on hiatus, and a few years after that point, Billy founded the band Coloursøund with Mike Peters from The Alarm. They released one self-titled album in 1999 before Billy returned to the Cult, and that seemed to be it. Until now. 22 years later, they've just released their new album, Coloursøund 2. We talk about that record in this interview, as well as Billy's upbringing in Northern England, his earliest experiences playing music with Johnny Marr and Morrissey before they went off to form the Smiths, the birth of the Cult and their late 80s success, and loads more. But we started by talking about Coloursøund's new album, Coloursøund 2. How does it feel to be talking about a new Coloursøund album this far on from the first one?
It's a little strange. Everything I think for everybody in the last year or so has been a little surreal. So it is bizarre to have kind of fairly easily recorded an album. Pretty much, we did write it before. It was conceived before any kind of global pandemic type situations arose, but we pretty much recorded it during all that, which was nice. Mike Peters probably wouldn't have had the time otherwise, being that he's the busiest man in rock officially, and has been. But it's strange. In some respects, it's very easy. I think when as a musician you find a songwriting partner that's easy, and as easy as me and Mike worked together, then it really was no great challenge. I'm fortunate in that respect that it seemed to come together very easily, which was lucky, and handy and all that. And I think that's great when musicians, kind of get along and it's harmonious, then it should be easy. The time lapse is interesting. I tend to try and not look back too much these days. Because you start doing weird mathematical calculations and about 80 years and 20 and all that. And so I try not to, but it's funny, although it felt very comfortable. And me and Mike are sort of friends. We don't see each other all the time. He is super, super busy always, by choice.
Yeah.
And but I see him when I can, and we're very good. He almost feels like kind of like a brother to me, really.
And because I understand that the genesis of doing the second album was you sent Mike a riff in 2019 over email. What was the thinking there? Did you have this in mind that, all right, we're going to do this, or was it just, I'm going to send you a riff and let's see what happens?
It was more the latter, but I mean, obviously we knew we'd done a great album with the first Coloursøund album, he said quite immodestly in the third person. I think what it was, and it is related in some respects to me writing music with the Cult and for the Cult, in that obviously writing for as long as I have with Ian, with the Cult, it gets to a point where there's probably music that I'm coming up with that, while it's good, might not be suitable for where the Cult is at now. And I don't want to see it just wasted. So one of these things, it's not so much, I don't want people to get the idea that this is some sort of leftovers. They're just inappropriate. The first Coloursøund album probably would have been my contribution to a Cult album, had the Cult been together in the late 90s, but we weren't. So the band kind of went on a break, broke up, hiatus, whatever you want to call it, between 95 and 99. And right in that period is when I wrote the first Coloursøund record with Mike.
Was there a moment when you were putting the songs together for Coloursøund 2? Was there a song that just made it clear that, all right, we can do this?
Well, it was just the first one, really, even though that's probably the most predictable song of all of them, that where you're like, oh, well, this is the singer from The Alarm and the guitar player from The Cult. What do you think that baby's going to look like? It looks like Paradise Free People. And I wouldn't want to do a whole album of that. But that was it felt good. It felt real. It wasn't a drag to put it together. And I think another thing about that was the spontaneity of it. This wasn't a project that we labored over. Mm. Work was done. I don't want people to think it's like a couple of old lazy rock stars just, quaffing and just doing like some ridiculously lazy, sloppy thing. We both believe in quality, not quantity of what we do. So, that was one thing. But that was the one. And then, funnily enough, after we'd done we kind of got together and wrote the album. I'm sure you might mention about this. We went to this cottage in Wales on the coast in January, and it was pretty much exactly like you'd think a cottage in Wales on the coast in January would be. Lots of cups of tea, lots of overcoats and Wellington boots and woolly hats, and it was amazing, and we came up with a lot of stuff.
And that setting sounds quite different to the setting for the first Coloursøund album, which, if I'm correct in thinking, was in Hawaii with Bob Rock. Is that correct?
Well, the first one that was demos. I managed to get Bob, and we managed to make a great holiday work trip out of that one to get to go to Hawaii, and we did some stuff with Bob in his home studio there, which I'd done. I knew he'd moved there. I hadn't yet worked there with the Cult. That came a little bit later when we got back together. But that was more of a demo. We never really technically went into a proper studio. We, funnily enough, recorded the first Coloursøund up in the mountains of North Wales at this bloke's I literally, if you can hear one song, there's a chicken on it clucking in the background of a quiet song because there was a chicken and that's what chickens do. We recorded it outside. That was great. I thoroughly enjoyed that because for me, it was so different to my experiences with my career with the Cult, which was generally had ended up being in studios in big cities, which I personally don't care for. I mean, it was cool to do an album in New York and an album in Vancouver, but for my own personal comfort, I'm still a bit of a rock fantasist. So I like the idea of Jimmy Page and Robert Plant going to a cottage in Wales and writing songs about California, And, all the years that I've been in and out living in California, I've often dreamt of going to record in a studio in Wales and, wearing welly boots and, stepping in cow shit, really. Luckily, that's kind of where we ended up doing it. So
you mentioned when you did that first Coloursøund album that it was at a point where the Cult was on hiatus. What point were you at in your career? What did Coloursøund represent to you? Was it a new direction, a new beginning? What was the thinking?
It was interesting. That's a very good question because for me, it was definitely on a personal level. The Cult kind of in '95 sort of broke up in somewhat sudden circumstances. It wasn't like it had been brewing. It may have been brewing, and certainly was brewing in Ian's mind. I was just in the middle of a tour and we actually broke up in Rio de Janeiro, apparently. Ian just left the tour and, he'd had enough, whatever his reasons were. We'd had a pretty tough time of it as a band. We'd had some horrendous, unfair kind of lawsuit for gazillions of dollars about some album sleeve that we would have happily put the album out in a brown paper bag had we known. It was a very distressing and unfair example of not getting justice, you get the law. And that kind of nearly broke us because it was very, very expensive. Put that on the back of the fact that grunge had happened and we were kind of reinventing ourselves as a band and trying to re-examine, where we were at and where we were going forwards, all that pressure, plus probably just the personal pressures of doing nothing but the Cult for 13 years straight, led us to need a break. And in reflection, I agreed with Ian's, if not his method, then I agree that at that point we were kind of broken and we were just struggling along, injured, and not knowing we really needed to take some time off. So, in answer to your question, I find myself in 1995 not knowing where I was going to go. I had my whole year planned out, as I always had, as where does Billy Duffy, guitar player of the Cult, go, and what does he do? Well, suddenly it's Billy Duffy, full stop, and it changed a lot of things. So, that, I ended up back in the UK, funnily enough, and I lived in the UK from most of 96, 97, 98, right into 99. And it just was, I went back to the UK and kind of centered myself. I was pretty much done with living in Los Angeles, and it felt like a chapter in my life had changed. And as a result of that, I ended up meeting different musicians. I played with a guy called Miles from the Wonder Stuff, an English band, briefly. And I just was looking around. It was very hard to go from being a guy who was doing hundreds of gigs a year, making albums and being that guy, to just being a bloke who's like, ex-member of a band, currently unemployed.
Yeah, and very, very suddenly as well.
Yeah, it was somewhat sudden, yeah, I've got to say. So, that's how I ended up. But I kept meeting Mike at events in England. I remember going to the UK and spending a lot of the time going to festivals. It was a good time in England in sort of 96, 97, 98. Socially, there was a new government, there was a lot of positive energy, a lot of new bands that have gone on to be amazing. And I kept seeing Mike at festivals and stuff, and eventually he invited me out to his lovely house in North Wales. And eventually the guitars came out, but not as soon as you'd think. We just sort of were mates, and we played a lot of football together, and we got a lot of rivalry between our football teams.
Sure.
And it actually came from a good place energetically. It really was a good, and I think that's why Coloursøund is easy to revisit again.
And does it feel like doing Coloursøund 2 now also not only gives you the opportunity to put a new album out, but also to give life to this first album? Because the first album didn't, from what I understand, didn't really get to do what you would have hoped.
No, not at all. Unfortunately, for Coloursøund, I got the opportunity was presented to me to reactivate the Cult, which I don't regret, obviously, because the Cult eventually, is my life's work, really. I've put, the best part of my adult life into the Cult, so has Ian. So, I'd always, Mike knew that. He knew that the Cult was something that I was never going to not do, as long as my relationship with Ian was a workable one, and we had the good enough relationship to work together then. And unfortunately, it happened. I remember I was at Mike's house and I got a phone call from some guy who claimed to know Ian's manager, and would you be? So I just investigated that, and then there was an incredible amount of interest and not a small amount of money offered for the Cult to get back together in 99. It was just before all the big record deals went. So that's why the Coloursøund album got kind of left, unfortunately.
And when you went back with Ian, was there, I guess your trust had been compromised perhaps when he left that initial tour so quickly. Were there bridges that needed to be mended with Ian, or?
I think both ways. Yeah, I think, it's pretty much like a kind of a marriage, I think by now you've probably heard enough guys in bands. In my situation, the guitar player, lead singer type relationship is a bit like a marriage. We were good. We didn't, to be honest, back in 95. It's not like we were at each other's throats. Within a week or so, we were civil enough to sit down round a table and discuss it and say, we probably should give this a break for a while. And, we made it official with the label Beggars Banquet. And I remember that Martin, the owner of Beggars, flew out and we sat around and it was, cordial. I think we wrote it on a napkin, actually, at the Sunset Marquee Hotel in Los Angeles, which is a pretty famous rock and roll watering hole. And we had a meeting and it was civilized. We were just beat, a bit tired. and I just think that we needed to go away and kind of lick our wounds and reassess. People say, why didn't you want to make a solo album? It's like, generally, most cult albums have been like a solo album for me. That's why I've always worked with Ian, because I have the freedom and worked with a label like Beggars Banquet, which are artist and art first, business second. We've always had that relationship with them. And even though our records have come out through major other corporate labels, that's only a licensing deal. Our contract, the blood bond, is between the Cult and Beggars Banquet, which is a British independent label. And that's been the case since 1983. So when we first released our first EP on a handshake called Death Cult, the Death Cult EP was done on a handshake. There was no contract. And that's how me and Ian like to work, which is not to say we will refuse to work with corporate entities. It's just that I don't particularly want to be bedfellows with them. I'd rather keep them at arm's length if that's possible.
Sure.
So that's how we've run the Cult, and that's kind of how Coloursøund's run. It's like a little cottage industry. It's very self-supporting. Coloursøund just pays for itself. It's not, nobody's getting rich off Coloursøund. We just do it for the love of it. And hopefully for the love of providing possibly the type of rock music that's a little bit thin on the ground lately, new.
Well, you think of your path to Coloursøund and your path to the Cult. I mean, we go all the way back to your teen years growing up in Manchester and picking up a guitar. And it sounds like such an incredible period, that late 70s period, to be learning about guitar, because 1977, you leave high school right in the epicenter of punk rock. So you know life pre-punk and life after punk. What was the difference between the two for you?
It was probably to do more with your haircut and the width of your trousers, if I'm being totally honest. But yeah, there were some through lines, like pre-punk, it was okay, you could like Thin Lizzy were okay, Mott the Hoople were really okay, obviously Bowie, Roxy Music were all okay. And then it started getting a bit questionable because I kind of like Free.
Okay.
I like some rock bands, Sensational Alex Harvey Band. I was just like a little nerdy rock and roll kid who just loved everything about the idea of being not the singer. I never wanted to be a singer or frontman. I just wanted to be the guitar player in a rock band. That's all. It was very simple. I read a book by Ian Hunter from Mott the Hoople called, I've said this story before, but it is true. I read Diary of a Rock and Roll Star by Ian Hunter, which is just basically an account of a very decent guy going on tour with his band who nearly split up. Bowie wrote them a song and kind of saved them. And they became this like well-known band who toured America. And I just wanted to be Mick Ralphs, really. Right. The guitar player in Mott the Hoople, write some cool riffs, buy some nice guitars, meet some exciting women, have a nice life, That was me. And then punk happened. And then suddenly it was like, that's interesting. Oh, so what I just described was a fantasy. Then having seen the punk bands play, and suddenly there were venues opening and people doing stuff, and I was getting involved, putting up posters. I was the lookout for the illegal fly posters I used to have about 300 copies of Nevermind the Bollocks, the big yellow poster that was wall-sized, this album sleeve. I had them under my bed at my parents' house because we didn't know how to... It was illegal, but the record labels used to send them up on a train from London. We'd pick them up at Piccadilly Station in Manchester. It was called Red Star. It was a parcel service. And we'd go and put up the fly posters illegally for legal albums, but we couldn't dispose of the extras. And they were just, I remember if I only had those posters now.
How did you get into that, though? Like, why were you...
It's just guys I knew in the neighbourhood in South Manchester. I just grew up in a part of South Manchester where there were a couple of bands. The reason why I went to see the Sex Pistols was that a local band called Slaughter and the Dogs were playing, and they were part involved in putting the gig on. And they were on the bill, so they were local. So I could relate. It's like these local lads from my neighbourhood were playing. And I'd read about the Sex Pistols in the music magazines and seen pictures of the spiky hair and John Lydon sticking chewing gum on the picture of the Beatles, which was a picture sleeve and a record shop in Soho in London. And they used to have these special imported singles of the Beatles and that, whatever. But I just was intrigued by this. And this was July 76.
Okay.
And I was 15. I hadn't even done my O-levels yet. So I had another about 9 months of school left after that. So that's what happened. And I saw that gig, and it didn't necessarily mean that I hated all rock, but it certainly made you throw out your more questionable, prog rock, weird, pretentious, My Emerson, Lake and Palmer album went out the window right quick. But I pontificated over Free, because I still thought Free were just too pure and good to, they just got hidden.
Sure. Well, it sounds, you mentioned you were sort of 15, 16 when a lot of this was happening. And I understand that you would actually, you I think had a band with some friends, and you would get together at a friend's house, and you would, I guess, play and rehearse and talk about guitars. And Johnny Marr was one of the people from Johnny Marr who'd go on to be in the Smiths. He turned up to there as well. What do you remember of those sessions? Because Johnny, I've seen an interview with him where he remembers them being very serious. You were all very serious about your guitars.
Oh, we took it very, very, very serious. We had all the gear and no idea. We just, we didn't go to school together. I did go to the same school as his wife. And I did, and Andy Rourke from the Smiths. They all went to my school. Johnny went to another school, but he lived across the road from where we rehearsed. And he used to come and hang out and just watch and just observe. And we'd literally played in the hallway of my friend's parents' house, which shows is some testament to the quality of pre-war British architecture, that they could sit in the living room watching telly, and you could have like a 5-piece, terrible high school rock band playing in the hallway. And I do have photographic evidence of I've got like 2 photos of those rehearsals. It's so funny. I mean, and Johnny was just like a friend, and, we're still friends today. We've known each other for a long, long time. And he had a sort of a similar sort of thing with me in that he eventually, started working in a clothes shop. I ended up working in a clothes shop in London after I'd gone down there, and was, and then, funnily enough, he used to come down from Manchester with Angie, his wife, and would buy clothes off me because I worked in the warehouse of this clothes shop, and I would ship clothes all around the world. I worked for this company called Johnson's, who made all the rock and roll stuff in London around 79, 80. And 81. So that was the period, I'd been in a few bands, nothing had panned out. I was working in this clothes shop, and Johnny was doing the same up in Manchester, trying to get something together that ultimately led into the Smiths. And, I believe I introduced Johnny to Morrissey, but I don't, or Stephen as he was called back then. I don't remember it, but everybody tells me I did. So
you were actually in a band with Morrissey briefly, the Nosebleeds.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And we did 2 gigs in Manchester in 1978. It was great. Stephen had great lyrics already, all typed out.
Sure.
And and that was it. We did a couple of gigs. I was still living with my parents. Mm-hmm. I was still signing on the dole. This is 1978. I've got like no future, man. Mm-hmm. Like no real, few O-levels. I don't know what I want to do. I'm not getting along with my dad. So I got offered to join a band. Slaughter and the Dogs, the other Wythenshawe band, they'd broken up as well. And their guitar player, Mick Rossi, who's still a mate of mine, went, I'm going to sing. Do you want to be the rhythm guitar player in the band? We've got a record deal on DJM Records. And I went, a record deal? Like a proper record deal with money and stuff? And they went, yeah. And I said, isn't DJM the label that Elton John was on? Isn't that Elton John's, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road and all that? He said, oh, yeah. And we're moving to London, and we've got a flat in London, and there's a room there for you and a wage.
Wow.
So I made the decision in about half a second I'll take that gig. And unfortunately, again, I kind of left behind the Nosebleeds because, we'd done 2 gigs. We had no record deal. There was no money. I was living with my parents, and I just had to get out of there. And that's where it ended for me. In January 1979, I moved to London with this band, which became Studio Sweethearts.
Yeah.
And we were, I forgot to mention, we were managed by David Bowie's old manager.
Right.
So you've got to understand what was offered to me, you know, as a 17-year-old kid on the dole. David Bowie's manager, a guy who's managed David Bowie, manages us. We're on Elton John's label. We're doing demos, recording a single. I'm getting a wage. You know, I would have been a fool to turn it down. And luckily, I did my great service to the world, and the world got the Smiths out of it. So
That's it.
I think that was a win for everybody there.
After the break, Billy talks about forming the Cult, working with Rick Rubin on the Electric album, and his memories of touring Australia on the big day out. Welcome back to Humans of Music and my interview with Billy Duffy. So you're in London now, and we're going to move forward a little bit too. So you moved down to London with Studio Sweethearts, but another band that you play in London is Theatre of Hate. And one of the bands that supports you on a tour in 1982 is the Southern Death Cult, and featuring Ian Astbury on vocals. What do you remember of seeing Ian, and what was your first impression?
I remember where it was. It was a place called Keele University, which is outside Stoke-on-Trent in the Midlands, where Slash is from.
Okay.
And I watched them, and I remember just watching. I saw them, and they looked amazing. If you ever see any photographs of Ian in the Southern Death Cult, it's literally like Daniel Day-Lewis in Last of the Mohicans, but dressed up like one of the actual Hurons or something. It was incredible.
Right.
And but he had the voice to go with it. You know, I watched them come on stage. The band started, 3 of them, Barry, Buzz and Aki, and they started playing this song called The Crow, which is a pretty cool Southern Death Cult song, very tribal. They all look great, but they were Northerners, which is a big deal in England.
Okay.
It's hard to explain, North-South thing, you know, you whatever. And then this guy sort of dances across the stage doing this like kind of Indian robotic, like Native American kind of fucking ghost dance thing. And he turns around and goes, in this really broad Northern accent, with a bit of a twang of North America, which is key. We are called Southern Death Cult. This song's called The Crow. And off he went, and he had this most amazing voice, and he just blew my mind. I was watching it with Theatre of Hate's bass player, Stan, and we both looked at each other and was like, what the, you know?
Right.
What's this? And that was how I first experienced Mr. Astbury. Stunning.
Did you instantly think, I want to work with this guy?
No, not at all. No, that didn't come into my mind for a long time. It wasn't that. We became friends on tour. We kind of bonded. I think they say that I had the cigarettes and they were all poor. We got on because we were like from the northwest of England, and we just sort of... And Theatre of Hate, in fairness, was not what I would call a happy band to be in. There was definitely a lot of interpersonal backfighting and weirdness in Theatre of Hate, which was a shame. I got booted out. I got kicked out of Theatre of Hate. There was an argument. I was probably too opinionated to be in somebody else's band. And I went back to London with my tail between my legs, got a job in a clothes shop again. People used to come in and go, weren't you the guy? Didn't I see you on top of the... I was like, yeah, that was me. Now I'm back in a clothes shop with no money. And eventually, what I remember happening, I was living in Brixton in some kind of cheap accommodation that wasn't a squat, but it was almost. And Ian Astbury's brother, Brian, came down because there was like a network of these bands and we were all sort of friends. And he says to me, Ian's been talking, wanted me to ask you if you wanted to find you and talk to you. And it had turned out that Ian was unhappy in Southern Death Cult. He wasn't feeling that the band guys, even though they were doing well, the chemistry wasn't right. There was no longevity in Southern Death Cult. Mm-hmm. And he'd liked the way I played guitar. He once said he heard me messing around playing some Jimi Hendrix riff in a sound check to be naughty because you weren't supposed to play Jimi Hendrix. You know, it wasn't allowed because that was hippie music. And on a Gretsch. And he just remembered that it sounded interesting. Anyway, so cut a long story short, 1983, Brixton, Ian comes down. He spends the weekend. We sleep in the same bed. We write 4 songs and the Death Cult is born.
How ambitious were you at that point?
Very, very, very ambitious. I would say I was quite careerist. I'd had the success. I'd been on telly, I'd been on Top of the Pops, the British. There was only 2 TV shows in Britain at the time, maybe 3. To get on this icon and play it, and then suddenly have it all taken away from you, and you're back on the scrap heap, was a little traumatic. So I clung onto the opportunity with both hands and feet with Ian. And we had a lot of common ground. It wasn't like it was difficult. We both just wanted to make a living and a career out of being in a band that wasn't faddy, that wasn't going to burst up in flames 2 years later. And that's how the Death Cult was born. And then we kind of realized Death. There was a lot of those gothic bands around, and a lot of people like covering themselves in talcum powder and being weird and trying to be like bats. And we were just like, what is all this? So we just thought, well, we best just call ourselves the Cult and have at it. And that's what we did in '84. So that's how the Cult started.
Yeah. And then fast forward several years from that point, and you have great success, obviously, with Electric and with Sonic Temple. And you're effectively a rock star, and you have money coming in and playing in big crowds. Is that a big adjustment from your upbringing? Because you're very working class upbringing in Manchester. Does it take time to acclimatize to that sort of success?
Yeah, there's like material success, and there's also notoriety and fame. There's like a couple of different things going on. We didn't make money until later than you'd think with the Cult. It's not that we weren't smart. I mean, I've always been reasonably astute with business. I haven't made too many calamities intentionally. But there's a challenge with bands when a band gets successful, and when you're all initially together and you're all in the back of the van sharing the pain, and then you all make a bit of money, and then suddenly you start going, It's kind of like what you call FU money,
right?
And then you have to really decide, do I really love these guys? Do I really love this? And some guys don't. And some guys have ended up in rock bands accidentally. It sounds amazing, but there's people who actually, if they're really honest, would rather be a painter or an actor they don't want to do, 5 nights a week in the back of a van in some stinky place. But I was a lifer, for rock and roll, Daddy of a rock and roll star. I was like, that's the life I want. And, that's what the life I got. So
sure.
I was committed to it, warts and all.
Okay.
And got lucky. But yeah, when the Cult first made some, you mentioned the Electric and Sonic Temple, but we also did well with, prior to that, we did well with an album called Love, which is still one of my favorite albums. And it didn't do well in America, only on a college level. Electric is one that got us known in the wider audience. It was still an underground album, but a success nonetheless. And we got signed to Warner's with Beggars Banquet. And Jeff Aroff once sat me and Ian down once, and he was this sage guy with a big beard and glasses. And he basically looked like Rick Rubin before Rick Rubin looked like Rick Rubin. And he sat down and went, you and Ian have just got to figure out, do you want to do this for the rest of your lives and have a career with ups and downs and do this? Or do you want to just like go, boom, crash and burn? So, it's kind of obvious, 30 years later, what path we chose. We wanted to be around for a while.
But how do you do that? It's easy to say that, but it's another thing to do it. How do you do it?
It's basically decisions that are cumulative. I don't think there is obviously certainly major decisions, but it's like a death of 1,000 cuts. The Cult have obviously had to compromise. I think any band, Mike in the Alarm, all the bands who have had success, any band is that you always have to compromise a bit. And it's just a question of how much you can live with that compromise and how much you feel the benefits outweigh the detriments to your kind of psyche. But there's a lot of decisions you can make. Do you want to do a cover version? That was suggested to the Cult before we did She Sells Sanctuary, because we were floundering a bit. We were writing, we were good, we were doing gigs, our career was doing well in England, but we hadn't had that hit single, and a lot of our peers had hits and been on Top of the Pops. And I knew what Top of the Pops was because I'd been on it with Theatre of Hate, and I wanted to be back on it with my band, The Cult, where I wrote the music. And eventually, I remember having a meeting and there was a suggestion, have you thought of doing like an Iggy Pop song? And I'm like, I remember because I was young and an idiot, I was like, Iggy Pop can't have a hit with an Iggy Pop song. Why would we have a hit with an Iggy Pop song? Right. You know, later, you know, David Bowie does China Girl anyway. But very fortunately, right after that, we wrote She Sells Sanctuary and things were changed. So we never had to do that. But those are the kind of compromises that are made to musicians. Do you want a hit? Here's a songwriter.
Right.
This will be a great record for you, not necessarily with you. Right. Meaning you're not going to play on your own record.
Wow.
There's lots of all that goes on. Those are the things in answer to your question. Any combination of those, mix and match. If you're around long enough, all those things will come to head, let alone just the simple interpersonal stuff between band members, sure. You know, which is the biggest one, and their wives or whatever they are then.
Right.
You know what I mean? If you refer to Spinal Tap, Janine's, you've got to overcome all that. You know, the astrological sign sweaters and, you know, and can you mix heavy metal in Dobley? You know, there's always going to be those pearls of wisdom to overcome. Which are pretty amusing, really. But anyway.
But you mentioned She Sells Sanctuary and the fact that you were floundering a little bit and it was suggested you do a cover. To then, which just makes that next leap into electric, to really take a right-hand turn into AC/DC territory and work with Rick Rubin. It makes it even a bolder move. And I know there'd been a false start prior to that with the Peace album, but still, to take that turn, that's a bold move. Were you nervous at the time or were you just confident?
We were a bit desperate. I think we realised the ship was sinking and we saw a little life raft with HMS Rick Rubin on it. And we jumped on board, you know, and it was, Rick was all very hard tack and, you know, the lash. But, you know, in the traditions of the Royal Navy, an American version. No, I mean, I'm kidding, but, you know, we're not stupid. We did the album Love. We had hit singles with it in England. We didn't quite connect in America with it. So we started writing the follow-up. And the most important thing probably was we went on tour a lot. And we went all around the United States. And we were just absorbing different kind of music. We were listening to rock on the radio everywhere. People weren't sort of apologetically going, I like the Doors, I'm sorry. You know, like in England, I like Led Zeppelin, whispering it. You know, in America, it was like okay to like the Doors or Led Zeppelin or Aerosmith or whatever rock band. You know, they embraced that kind of music, unlike in the UK, where because of punk, the tendrils of punk had made it so, you know, the rules and regulations of punk conformity, which in itself is an oxymoron, but there were, you know, and we just rejected it. I mean, the album Love was called Love for a reason, just to wind up the English press. Ian grew his hair really long, you know, on purpose, and did, you know, started wearing flares and psychedelic gear. And I was like, oh, well, you know, I went short and spiky and did the psychedelic biker thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so yeah, the electric thing, it was just, we tried to do that album again. We wrote some songs and it just wasn't ready. We went in with the same producer who did Love, Steve Brown, who sadly passed away recently. And it just didn't work out. I don't know why. We weren't ready to record. Ian certainly wasn't ready to record. And we wasted a lot of time and money on Peace, you know, and instead of pulling the plug on it, we saw it through to the bitter end, hemorrhaged a load of money, which is why we didn't make money when we should have done. Mm. And then Rick kind of came forward as a bit of a lifeline, and he just seemed to cut through a lot of the chatter and just was kind of like, you like early AC/DC? And I went, yes, saw them in 77. You like early Aerosmith? I went, yes, didn't see them. Early Led Zeppelin? And we all went, yes. And he went, right, let's make a record. And that's what we, you know, that was as simple as that with Rick. And I think that was Rick's first recording with a band.
Okay.
He'd done stuff with it. I'd heard what he'd done with the Beastie Boys, Cookie Puss, particularly with the AC/DC riff, and, you know, and there was something happening. There was energy in New York and the fusion of that whole hip-hop thing, and it all coexisted. It was tribal, but there wasn't the negativity that I'd grown up with in England of, you know, I define myself by what I hate, which is, you know, okay, it's a way of doing things. Over there, it was a bit like everybody's different, but the Beastie Boys came down the studio and we started jamming on all our gear when we weren't there, like these little chimps, these like impy chimps came back. I was like, what are you doing? And they were jamming on our gear, and it was like weird, but fun. And that kind of changed us a little bit. And it also was a portent of what was to come. We knew rock was coming back. We couldn't probably articulate it, but I think the album states quite clearly our belief that some of the values of good rock music had been lost with punk. And there was just a lot of like, the 80s made some amazing music. It was going more keyboardy. That was great. Not for me, but, and there was some great bands, coming in the 80s as well. But in terms of out and out rock, it had become like you either had like, new metal, like Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, rock, metal, pop. And then it was like us. And we were kind of like more of a rock band. Ian's naturally got a kind of rock baritone voice. I'm naturally a rock guitar player by nature. So it wasn't the hardest leap for us, although it was traumatic to give up the Gretsch, grab a Les Paul and lose all my effects pedals. I'll still get nightmares about that sometimes.
Billy, just a couple of things before we finish up. I almost going back to where we started talking about with forming Coloursøund, and it had come off the back of that, I guess, the cult splitting in 95. And I just wanted to ask you about the 94 cult self-titled album.
Okay.
Really interesting point in the band's career, and the fact that, as you mentioned, grunge had happened, punk was about to happen. Did the fact that you had shape-shifted a little bit throughout your career make it easier for you to adapt to what was happening, or to try and change tack to fit in with what was going on at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I always thought that we always felt we tried to just reflect with every cult album that we make where we're at the time, as people. And, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, I don't necessarily know how you can make an album in any other way, but that's what that's what we felt we would do. And the album in 94 was just basically, we kind of reached the end of a sort of a run of 12 years. We did the Ceremony album, which didn't do as well as Sonic Temple, although the tour did better. So we had this dilemma where the album didn't sell, really, but the tour was even bigger but that was the momentum. It was kind of like built on the back of what we'd achieved over the previous decade. So we had a bit of come down to earth, and, there was a bit of a breakdown. We ended up getting that lawsuit that I mentioned earlier about the sleeve to Ceremony a couple of years later, which was quite astonishing, really, to get the brown envelope and, served at a gig, and you've got like numbers that are like, do they think that like we're the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, the Beatles all rolled into one? Wow. Who's making these numbers up? It's just like American lawsuits, luckily if you can avoid them, I recommend it because they're ridiculous. It's a very litigious country. But anyway, we got through that, but in the background of that horribleness, we tried to make this album and reimagine ourselves, which was basically, we'd become this huge arena kind of rock band with flowing hair, and we were pretty good at it. But we had to really break that down to really demolish it and start again. And I think Ian, as a lyricist and a person, wanted to be able to write more human lyrics. I think he struggled on Ceremony with his lyrics. I think if you look at, if cult fans can read the lyrics, there's quite a lot of which, to an average guy that works in a biscuit factory, it's not going to be too sympathetic to a guy complaining about the life on the road, turn the page and all that. But it is what it is. You can only deal with what you got to do. And I don't think Ian was completely in love with that lifestyle of being a huge rock star. I don't think it ever fitted that well with Ian. It fitted very well with me. I was very happy. But and so with the Cult album, we just basically dissolved everything, went back to basics, and I felt that Ian managed to express a lot of things lyrically that he wanted to talk about for years and he never could, because the music that we wrote, that I came up with, was less bombastic, less like rock and roll. So, it's hard. You know what I mean? That's the compromise and the artistic thing of working together with a partner. You know, occasionally I'd be very bullish and stubborn about, we're a rock band, we can't be doing this, we can't be doing that. Stay in your lane. And Ian's never in his lane. He's in any lane because he's a true artist, you know. So that's kind of how it was. And then that album, you know, it was just a weird time for us. But you know, the fans love that album. And I think it's very, very good from a point of view of an insight into Ian, you know, lyrically.
Yeah. I saw you on that tour down on the big day out down here. And then...
oh, mate.
And then...
Which gig were you at? Because that was one hell of a tour.
I was in Sydney. And then I saw the show at Selena's, the club show you did as well.
Well, it's Selena's. It was great to go back there because when we first went to Australia on Electric, we played Selena's twice, 2 nights at Selena's on that first tour. I remember in '87 going down to Australia and doing that. And then we were pretty wild at that point. I got to be honest. I want to apologise officially to the nation of Australia for our behaviour in 1987. We were mental. We'd been on the road with Billy Idol. Then we were on the road with Guns N' Roses, special guest for us, and then we ended, after all that debauchery, just ridiculousness of piracy, we ended up in Australia, you know, and it was not pretty. But I will say this, the Big Day Out was one of the best tours I've ever been on. Personally, we all agreed it was a great bunch of people. A lot of them were doing drugs. We weren't, but they were. Despite that, it was a fantastic... It was just the way it was run, you know, and all the bands being... You know what I'm talking about. Most bands enjoy that. There's a lot of camaraderie and... Well, what did they call it? The Big Day Off?
The Big Day Off.
You do like 2 gigs a week. And it was great, though, and it was all good, all good. Very happy memories of that.
Was that Ramones? Ramones were on that year, or...?
No, it was Ministry and the Cult headlined.
Oh, wow.
We had Hole, a very, very young, I believe, was it Silverchair?
Yep.
They were still in short pants. There was an Australian band who were pretty good that I'd never heard of. Was it UMI?
UMI, yeah, great band.
They were on it. I'd never heard of them, but they were on it. It was just a right laugh. Nice. I got to tell you, it was a lot of fun.
Just to finish up, Billy, Jaxsta is all about giving credit where credit is due. Are there people you'd give credit to for helping you get where you are today?
Loads of. I mean, you know, starting with my mum, who encouraged me a lot. My dad, who put his hand in his pocket, even though he wanted me to be a builder, like him, didn't understand this rock and roll business until he saw me on TV, and then that changed his mind. Steve Brown, the dearly departed producer of the Love album and She Sells Sanctuary, because without him at that moment, I don't know what would have happened, because his input was vital at that moment. You know, he just got the blend right for that record, and that was the platform in which, you know, there was the band before the Love album and Sanctuary, and then there was the band after. And so, you know, Steve, you know, Ian Astbury for putting up with me for all these years.
You mentioned your dad earlier, and was he a big music fan? Because I think he took you to your first show, which was Thin Lizzy and Slade and Suzi Quatro. Was that right, when you were 11?
Yeah, he did. He wasn't into... Yes, it was. It was in October 1972, because there are people out there who know that stuff. So if you mention a gig, people will go online and tell you, yes, it was October the 23rd, 1972, when Slade, Suzi Quatro and Thin Lizzy played at the Manchester Free Trade Hall. Anyway, so that would make me 12. Yeah, my dad wasn't into that kind of music at all, but he took me anyway. He was a gamer. And he liked Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett. Because my parents are quite older than me, so they weren't, you know, it wasn't like, you know, that was his kind of music. You know, he wasn't a 60s guy. You know, he was a 40s and 50s guy.
Good on him for taking you, though.
Oh, ballsy move. Sitting through all that, it was unbelievable.
All right, Billy, look, thanks so much for your time, mate. It's been so great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was a fantastic chat. I enjoyed it. I'm all good.
And that's it for another episode of Humans of Music. A big thanks to Billy for his time, and thank you for listening. This episode was mixed by Lachlan Mitchell from Parliament Studios in Annandale, and the incidental music and theme song were written and performed by Sam Lockwood. Please remember to subscribe to the Humans of Music podcast so you never miss an episode, or even better, share it amongst your friends and rate and review it. And remember, next time you need to know who wrote a song, who produced a song, who engineered it, who played on it, who sang on it, who did anything on it, head to jaxsta.com for all your official music credit information. Until the next episode of Humans of Music, I'm Rod Yates. Thanks for listening.